Our topic today is the transformation of America from an agricultural nation to an industrial and urban one. During the Gilded Age, we will see the movement of Americans from the countryside to the city, where factories and, more importantly, jobs existed in the second half of the 19th century. We will consider the technologies that drove this change, and the individuals who benefited from the industries that fed the industrialization, and in the experience of workers in factories and living in American cities at the end of the 19th century. We see a second industrial revolution in the second half of the 19th century. While England emerged from the first industrial revolution as the dominant industrial power, by the end of the second, the United States could claim the label world's most dominant industrial power. Four factors that led to America's ascendancy included new technologies, the many natural resources in the country, an area rich in coal, timber, iron, and eventually oil, navigable rivers that were beneficial for locating factories, and the entrance of millions of immigrants into the country would ultimately lead to the creation of an industrial and urban America. Technology in the 19th century made American businesses more productive and improved the lives of Americans. The chart shows the innovative nature of the time period. Notice how the number of patents granted by the U.S. government rapidly increases beginning in the 1860s. Growth in American industry was driven by technology. In the 1850s, Henry Bessemer created a process to convert iron into steel that was both cheap and efficient. This was known as the Bessemer process. As a building material, steel is lighter, stronger, and resistant to rust. The impact of the budding steel industry would help build the bridges and skyscrapers that would soon be commonplace in American cities across the country. Pittsburgh would emerge as the center of the American steel industry, and that's where that annoying team, quarterbacked by Ben Roethlisberger, gets its name. The light bulb, invented by Thomas Edison, would lead to the spread of electricity. Electricity would be used to power machines and factories. This meant that factories no longer had to be located near rivers and could run year-round. People would soon have electricity in their homes, dramatically changing their quality of life, and they would have electric streetcars to get from point A to point B. Edison also worked on the kinetoscope, which was one of the earliest devices for showing movies. You are watching Fred Ott sneeze from the year 1890. Only 5 seconds long, it would not be long before there would be full-length movies showing in movie theaters. Let's remember, this was a world with no computers, cell phones, or TVs. There was no Facebook, Twitter, or Xbox, so a 5-second movie of a man sneezing was entertaining. Alexander Graham Bell's telephone in 1894 changed the way people communicated. One could pick up this device and hear someone's voice on the other side of the country. This increased the speed at which people could conduct business. The Wright brothers created the first successful airplane in 1903, which would lead to the ability to move people and goods faster and farther in the 20th century. In the early 20th century, Henry Ford created a more efficient way to construct things in factories. The assembly line would become a common feature in American factories in the 20th century. Ford, of course, would use this assembly line to manufacture cars. Other innovations of the day that you can see here included the typewriter, cash register, calculating machine, adding machine, Kodak camera, the fountain pen, and then the Gillette safety razor. These innovations improved American business and made the lives of Americans better in the 19th century. Another development during this time was the emergence of big business. The dominant economic philosophy during the Gilded Age was laissez-faire, which is the idea that government should not play a role in the economy. This lack of government interference in the economy included the idea that there should be no tariffs, there should be no subsidies to industries. This was the free market that Adam Smith described in Wealth of Nations. This is capitalism. What we also see during this time period is the emergence of corporations and monopolies. A monopoly is when one company controls a majority of goods or services in a particular industry. What this leads to is elimination of most or all competition. What these companies tend to do is they drop the prices until they are able to get all of their smaller competitors out. Then they will eventually turn around and increase the price of goods. It leads to huge profits for the owners of these corporations. And it also ends up weakening the rights of workers, because there will be fewer places for them to choose to work. During the 19th century, we will see several individuals take advantage of the laissez-faire ideology to dominate certain industries. These lions of industry included Cornelius Vanderbilt, who dominated the railroad industry in the 19th century by taking over smaller railroad companies and creating a massive railroad empire. Vanderbilt provided an early example of monopoly in the American economy. J.P. Morgan was a banker who took over several companies and made a fortune by buying a controlling stake in corporations. With 51% of the shares in a company, Morgan could control these corporations. Morgan led the way in the mergers between companies that we see throughout this era. Andrew Carnegie did not come from wealth. He rose up from nothing to become one of the richest Americans ever. He was the man of steel before there was a Superman. At the turn of the 20th century, Carnegie Steel had 20,000 employees and produced more steel than all of the steel mills in England combined. In 1900, Carnegie sold his company to J.P. Morgan for $400 million. To put that into modern money, that's about $10 billion today. The first oil well was drilled by Edward Drake in 1859 in Pennsylvania. John D. Rockefeller and his Standard Oil Company would be king of the oil industry. By 1881, Rockefeller controlled 90% of the oil industry, effectively eliminating almost all of his competition. Standard Oil would be the model on which other industries like the sugar, meat, tobacco, and leather industries would follow during this time period. The policies and actions of these lions of industry would lead to calls for change from both workers and competitors. We will look at workers going on strike and the government's attempt to try to introduce competition back into the workplace in our next unit. This second industrial revolution led to the emergence of the factory system. The system had a profound impact on Americans, altering where they lived, the type of work they did, and the amount of time they spent working. These factories did not require skilled artisans who made things with their hands. Semi-skilled workers and unskilled workers could do the job. The work was repetitive, and workers did not take pride in what they produced like an artisan would. Workers were now part of the machine. The conditions under which most of these workers labored was horrifying. There was long days, very low pay. They were forced to live in tenement buildings near the factory. We'll talk about this in just a minute. The factories were not safe. They were poorly lit, poorly ventilated. The machines were not safe. Accidents on the job were common. And let's remember that there is no insurance against people getting injured. If you get injured on the job, you're just going to have to not get paid. Child labor is an issue. We see children as young as 6 years old working in factories. You can see in the center picture there. And entire families work in the factory. And factory owners like to hire women and children because they can pay them significantly less for the same job that a man would do. Just some images of children in factories. Here you can see small children with their mothers in the factory. If you have to go to work, you obviously don't have the means to pay for someone to watch your child. And again, you see young children working in factories. These young boys here, they're not going to school. This is their day. Okay, and again, the unsafe conditions, working around these machines with no shoes. And again, this is what it was like for many children in 19th century America. And we can just really quickly address 6 impacts of industrialization on America. By the year 1900, the United States has surpassed the countries of Europe and is now the dominant industrial power. The rich are getting richer, and the gap between rich and poor is increasing dramatically. We do see the development of a middle class. We see white-collar jobs, people who manage the factories, people who work in offices. We see more women on the job, but understand that women are getting paid significantly less than men, still something that comes up today. We see the emergence of labor unions, and what we're going to see in our next unit, violent clashes between labor and the people who own the factories, and ultimately the urbanization of America. We're going to see the growth of American cities as people move closer to the factories because that's where the jobs are. This movement of people from the country to the city is known as urbanization. Because jobs were located in factories and factories were located in cities, we see a flood of people into cities during the Gilded Age. Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, and of course New York City are among the early industrial centers where people would go. We will see the world's first subway in New York City in 1904. And cities will have trolleys and streetcars powered by electricity to move people around. As a result of this wave of people entering cities, there was a housing shortage and workers were forced to live in tenements. These tenements were located in the center of the city near the factory. These tenements packed as many people as possible into a small space. Most had no window access and were poorly ventilated. Lice and rats were common. Many lacked plumbing and lighting. Individuals used outside areas as a restroom, creating pits of human waste. These tenements were unsanitary and unsafe, but was the price people paid to have a job. To avoid being around this, wealthy and middle-class families moved away from the city into the suburbs surrounding the city. Streetcars would provide transportation into the city center for people to work. So we see America developing to the haves and the have-nots. Let's close the show by considering the photography of Jacob Riis. Riis is one of the most significant photographers who captured what these tenements were like and how the other half lives. The other half, of course, were the poor, the have-nots in American society. Riis captures children sleeping on the streets in New York. Look at the expression on this man's face. He captures families. You can see these people who dressed up for the photograph, but notice the small, cramped living conditions that they live in. Notice the number of people in a single room with all of their stuff. These tenements involve just jamming as many people into small areas. And again, the people go there because that's where the jobs are. Next time, we'll look at the African American experience during the Gilded Age. And until then, good night, Albuquerque.